the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's be at it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I've never seen such idiots in all my life.
That's Lord, they say.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio.
Okay, there, it looks like it's actually... Everything is broken today. Sorry, guys. Literally everything is broken today, except for my bones. I'm still healthy. There's that. And I was just saying in the chat, in our chat before the show, I swear to God, I died in 1984, and I'm in purgatory, and my punishment is everything not working the way that it's supposed to work. You know, like everything being broken or damaged. We have had some weird weather here. It's not that bad for Ohio. Like the storm, unless I'm just in a spot where I'm not getting the brunt of it, and someplace else that, you know, maybe affects my internet services, there's no reason why any of this should have happened. This is par for the course here, so I'm like all frustrated and everything. Yeah, my mind is broken today. I'm like, jeez. So there's no blog post for you guys to look at. Sorry, the blog isn't working today. I discovered the reason for the things that didn't look right to me last week in the timeline. When I'm working on the timeline, I'm working at it on it at night a lot on a computer that is a laptop I take back and forth to work, and I'm using it, you know, during my downtime, and I am keeping the same tabs as I work, and that's been my saving grace with this, because if I had closed the tab, I would have lost all of my work. And yeah, like. It has a save button, and I was pressing the save button, and it looked like it was saving. It was doing the little wheel, and everything, you know. Oh yes, processing something, now done processing, you can move on, and I'd go on to the next thing. Didn't save any of it. So I had to keep that tab open, and open a new tab and open a new instance of editing and then go through and at one at a time individually copy and paste all of my edits, copy the parts of the edit into an equivalent edit in the new tab, and then save. And when you save, it kicks you out of the editor, and you have to go back in and select to edit again, and then it takes you to the default edit types. So I had to re-choose every single one of these that you see here. I had to go through and re-choose to make it round, re-choose my colors because it wants to make it this ugly shade of green, and then save, and then go to the next one. Like copy paste all my stuff and save, and then go to the next one. So that's what I spent this week doing, was actually re-adding everything that I thought I added, and that didn't actually get added. So there's a lot of stuff on here that may not have been part of last week's show because the editing on the timeline was just completely fucked. So sorry about that. I'm not sure why the site works that way. It's designed for school teachers, and I'm not a school teacher. My background is in photography, and I do a little bit of graphic design, but not like artsy-fartsy graphic design. There is a flowchart going around on Twitter that feminists are pissed off about right now, called Feminist Logic, if I remember right, is what I called it. Anyway, it's a flowchart about the difference between men's reproductive rights and women's reproductive rights, and they're calling it a misogynistic flowchart. But it's got nothing on it that isn't true. So that's the kind of design I do, like infographics, and I started out with ad design, so nothing where I'm like drawing pictures because I suck at that really badly. But yeah, so this is not working the way that I expected it, but it's still the best one that I ran across. Stop telling me to save my work. In any case, so there's that issue, and I hope my internet doesn't kick off, because it really shouldn't. It really genuinely shouldn't. So all of that aside, hello and welcome to.
I'm time stamping this moment with my voice so that when I'm editing this for the Spreaker upload for the people who listen to these in pre-recorded podcast format, they don't have to listen to
all the fucking technical difficulties.
To all of the sorry for the technical difficulties section. Right,
insane.
Here's where we start. Hello and welcome to Honey Badger. Sorry, go on.
HBR Talk 308. Who voted in early America? And this one we'll be talking somewhat about who voted, but we'll also be talking somewhat about why. So, in any case, yeah, I'm your host Hannah Wallen here with Nonsense Annihilator Lauren Brooks, and we need the technical difficulties annihilator. That's what we need.
Yes.
And the personification.
That'd be me.
There we go.
Follow us on Spreaker. I'm here, the personification of perspectivity,
yes,
so that I can edit out all the technical difficulties, so that you don't have to scroll through what's usually 20 minutes of silence anyway.
Yeah.
We got you through that. Well, YouTube got you through that by itself by crapping out on this particular occasion.
Well, I mean, everything didn't work. When I started the show, OBS went ballistic.
We're doing it again. We're doing the sorry for technical difficulties bit again.
Like, it's just been
let's
such
do the show.
Like, literally everything. It's the end of my rope, guys. Just remember, I'm autistic, so this is hell for me. Things are supposed to work the way they're designed to work, damn it. But anyway, before we get on to the show, remind everybody that, as always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions when the technical difficulties don't keep us from talking. And as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justatip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page, except for this week, when we don't have a blog post because technical difficulties. To get on with it, there are things that I would have discussed last week and didn't. So I'm going to start a little behind where we ended the last time. So one of the first things that I wanted to mention is before we got to the actual Revolutionary War, before we got to the Boston Tea Party, even before some of the things happened that led to the Boston Tea Party, we had the colonists were already just fed up, and they were already grumbling about what was taking place between the UK and the colonies in the Americas. And a big part of the reason was because they had that lack of protection under the principles of the Magna Carta. They weren't being treated equally because, it wasn't like they could just pick up the phone and make a call, because there was no such thing. And it wasn't like they could just drive over or fly over, because those things didn't exist, right? So it was months in between communications that had to take place through the mail or in person via very dangerous travel across the Atlantic Ocean. So we have this tiny little blip at the bottom that you can barely see, is because it is a time span, and it's a short time span. There's a couple of those here. This one is the Continental Congress. See if I can get it to open up. Nope. There we go. Okay. So because Americans felt unrepresented, and they really didn't have their own representation. They had some people were sympathetic in Parliament, but there weren't representatives of the colonies in Parliament. They ended up in debate and in meetings and everything about what to do about this, that their interests were not being considered in Parliament. So time period is at the bottom here. Dang it, I didn't want to select that. There we go. So from October 7, 1765 to October 25th, 1765, they had this debate taking place, and they ended up creating a document as a result. Let's see. This is. Was somebody trying to talk?
I was going to say 2 weeks to have the debate, to come up with it. That's a nice, decent amount of time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You think of debates that happen these days. It's like, well, sit on this panel for an hour and let everyone else decide who won in the comments. It's a lot different from.
Yeah, they took this very seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about, you have to think about it from the time period, from the perspective of the time period, how things were. This was not a time frame when these guys went out to do this, and what they were discussing doing would leave them in an easy to deal with situation, right? The colonies were more civilized than they originally were. There was more capability of self-defense as a group and so on. They'd been involved in military conflicts. There was a population large enough that they had militias, and shortly thereafter they had a full military conflict and they won, which is why we're a nation and not a commonwealth. I guess Commonwealth is still a nation, but I mean we're a federation, not a commonwealth, because we didn't get made a nation by a later event we'll discuss that made a whole bunch of British colonies into their own autonomous nations.
Aren't there some states that are technically commonwealths, like Massachusetts?
Yeah, but
officially a commonwealth, whatever that even means.
But it's not. The country is not a commonwealth, right? It doesn't define the rest of the country. So, right. But we're a representative republic. That is it's actually supposed to be a loose confederation of states, which is one of the reasons why the South called itself the Confederacy during the Civil War, which we aren't to yet, so we're not going to discuss that extensively either yet. But I will say the Civil War happened due to similar reasons, actually, as the Revolutionary War. People felt unrepresented by their politicians. But out of the Continental Congress, which one of the things they looked at, I will point this out too. Among the various tribes of people who were here before the colonists, the people that you would consider indigenous, even though they also have been proved to migrate from actually overseas. So the Native Americans, First Nations, whatever you want to call them, Aboriginals, they had a loose confederation of tribes in the northeastern part of the continent. Well, I guess it'd really be more mid-eastern, not northeastern, because it stretched between the United States and Canada. They didn't have those borders, right? It was just all one big piece of land to them. Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and said, "That nurse Randomer Cam sure has a deep voice. Somebody pass her a throat lozenge. Ketchup. Women most affected." Oh wait, that's Mike. Sorry.
I'm not a real nurse. I'm not even a real doctor. I'm not even a real Randomer Cam. That's not even a real word.
Yeah, there we go. But yeah, the loose confederation is called the Six Nations, and it actually includes the tribe that my tiny amount of Native American heritage on my mom's side of the family comes from, but not the tiny amount on my dad's side of the family. That's different. So they had a constitution. They didn't call it a constitution, but they did have a set of governing principles. They had a whole bunch of interesting things, and at some point we may discuss that, because that's voting history too. In fact, they had a system wherein the tribal chiefs could only be men, but the voters could only be women. So they actually gendered it. It's kind of interesting. And the Continental Congress picked up some things from that and used those. It also picked up some things from Magna Carta and used those. So we end up with this document. They met in New York City's Federal Hall for 18 days to hash this out. Right? They composed and signed the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which addressed the whole taxation without parliamentary representation, the burdens and hardships that Parliament's recent legislation had caused the colonists, basically making British goods unaffordable, but then outlawing alternatives. And the right to trial by jury. Because remember I think we talked last week about some of the stipulations that were in the laws that Britain had been imposing on the states, and it was inconvenient for the British government to have to deal with trial by jury and such when crimes were alleged overseas in the colonies, and again, we're talking months between communications, and they would have to send somebody, or they would have to trust that the colonies would have somebody. So they basically imposed maritime, some aspects of maritime law, and one of those was at that time, I don't know if this is still a thing, but you don't get trial by jury in an emergency situation because there might not be a jury available, or the situation might be so dire that they don't have time for a jury trial in order to stop the problem. But I have the Declaration of Rights and Freedoms, or Rights and Grievances here, and this was sort of in response to the Stamp Act, but the Stamp Act was sort of the final straw before this. Not the final straw of things, but it was the final straw before this. And remember, the Stamp Act imposed a whole bunch of different taxes and created some monopolies, and it basically brought the heavy hand of the monarchy down on the colonists. So I'm not gonna read it the whole way through verbatim, but you'll notice that in the first paragraph, that they try to kiss the king's ass just enough, which you're supposed to do under a monarchy, I guess, to avoid getting in trouble for saying for backtalk. Like, when you're mad about something that your parents did as a kid, when you're a kid, and you're like going to tell them your rules suck and I don't want to follow them, but you can't just walk up to mom and dad and be like, your rules suck and I don't want to follow them, because you will get whatever type of punishment they like to do for misbehavior. Which in my case, they might have actually said, okay, let's see how that goes. And then I would have had to deal with the fallout afterwards. And I would have had to talk about it and analyze it and admit where I was wrong. So that would have really sucked, right? So they come along, Mom, Dad, I really love you, but I hate your rules.
We're beginning to see what happens in certain democracies if you actually criticize the government.
Yeah.
Particularly in Canada and in the UK and in all parts across Europe. If you say anything the government doesn't like, they'll accuse you of hate speech. Even if you say it in your own home and someone else snitches on you to the government, much like the Stasi. It's not just absolute monarchies where this happens, or even...
Well, the difference is in an absolute monarchy, you don't just get some sort of censure, or you're investigated by 3-letter agencies and called names online and stuff for it. You end up swinging from a rope.
We'll wait and see, shall we?
We may see that. I don't know that I would consider the situation in the United States today to be very democratic, considering the things that have come out. It's just, and I'm not going to expand on that. YouTube can get mad at us for being vague, but they won't get mad at us for saying things that you're not allowed to say on YouTube. So there you go. If you want to hear more about that, you're going to have to contact me directly.
Whether it's a democratic government or an absolute monarchist government, they should only be given access to a small amount of lackeys who are even able to perform these state-sponsored hangings. Because as long as they are restricted to a small amount of lackeys, they won't be able to. They won't have the resources to come after everyone who says "fuck the king." That's what we're looking at. That's what we're looking for. I want a king or a democratically elected government who doesn't have the money or resources to enact the worst possible punishments on all of the people who complain about their tyranny. That's how it should work. Maybe they can, I don't know, make an example of someone, but as long as we know that their power is diminished enough not to be able to come after everyone who breaks the unjust laws, then we can say, fuck you. We are, in our masses, going to break these unjust laws, and there's nothing you can do about it because you don't have the resources to do it. What we found ourselves in right now, and I mean especially the UK and Canada and Australia and a lot of Europe, like we've given this already bloated government all the power and resources it needs to come after everyone who even says boo to a goose. Because simultaneously they can't be bothered sorting out burglaries and murders and all that shit.
Yeah.
That takes effort.
Yep.
They're putting all of their resources into coming after people who go online and say boo to a goose. They're only able to do this because they have accrued so much power. Fucking needless to say, afuera!
Yep.
Mm.
Well,
Yeah.
in my case, I simply blocked the goose because I'm not her husband and I don't have to put up with her henpecking. So there.
What
you
about
go.
the gander? What about the gander?
Oh, I'm laughing at the gander. So there's a
Is it
dude. There's this
propaganda?
male feminist that is he's like a male feminist stereotype bot that you poke, and he does a stereotypical male feminist thing every time you poke him, and it's hilarious and sad. So I'm actually kind of just keeping the channel open to that one because of the humor part, you know. But when it gets so sad that it's not funny anymore, I'll probably block him too because that gets old. But yeah, in any case. So what happened with the Declaration of Rights was, they had the opening, Mom, Dad, I still love you, but we're having some problems, and here's what they are. We're an adult now. That's basically, the colonies had been, like, the government of Britain had its hands full with Britain and with running multiple colonized areas. A lot was left to the tea companies, right? The Indian trading companies, the British, the English one, the Dutch one, and the French one, which they were all in competition with each other, right? And so the colonists, a lot of the hardships that they dealt with on their own. They didn't have, today you turn to the government for help with every little thing. If there is a natural disaster, there's a flood, there's a tornado, there's a blizzard, there's a drought, and no crops are grown in a particular area during a particular time. If there's crime, if there's an inability to get things shipped to your area due to problems, you go to Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam's like, well, here's some stuff that you paid for by your tax dollars, and or here's the stuff that the men in your community paid for with their tax dollars, because women are already getting theirs back through a whole variety of agencies and stuff. FEMA didn't exist. None of that stuff existed. There was no welfare. The churches were not wealthy. They got their money from donations from the public. Right? They didn't have a lot. So there wasn't a safety net here. The safety net was the individual and the community working together to address problems, to address, if there was a fire, there wasn't even a fire department, there was a fire brigade, and it was all volunteer. Right? That's how that was at the time. So when all of this sudden interest in taxation and regulation and monopolizing goods and calling it smuggling if you traded in goods that were not from the trading companies, the approved trading companies, like that pissed everybody off. So they pointed out, yes, the colonies owe the same allegiance to the crown as any other subjects. Yes, the colonies are entitled, therefore, to the same inherent rights and privileges of natural-born English citizens. Unfortunately, and it's essential to the freedom of the people, it's undoubted, you can't question this, that as one of those rights, there should be no taxation without representation. That it is by the people's consent that the government is entitled to govern, and not just like that was established. Remember, by the barons that stood up and told the king, fuck you, no, we're not spending any more money on these stupid things that you're doing that are failing. We need a say in this, and we want to have this great council, and you can't ignore us anymore. And then they had bloody battles to establish that. So this is long established by now. It's couple hundred years later, more than. So there's no reason why this shouldn't have been understood. I didn't go over the Mayflower Compact. I haven't actually added that to the timeline yet, but I will. But at this point, we're sort of, because of how much there is, I'm sort of highlighting this just because it's a contributing factor to the formation of the system of government in the United States, and that affects how voting evolved here. And this is kind of why it formed this way. Right? They had this beef. The only representation of the people that the colonists had were people who maybe sympathized with the colonies a little bit, but they didn't actually have appointed representatives. So that was one of the things. They felt that it was very unreasonable. And then after several points that addressed that, then they finally said, also, trial by jury is an inherent right to every British subject, and you shouldn't be denying that to us. So they specifically mention the Stamp Act and say, yeah, we're mad about this because it takes away those rights. It taxes without representation. The taxes are burdensome. You have taken away our right to trial by jury, and so it's subverting the rights and liberties of the colonists. And what it's caused then, it goes through and lays out, here are some of the problems that are caused. We have now got a scarcity of goods that we need, and it's essentially acknowledged that Americans are paying for things they're not getting because of this, and so they're respectfully demanding representation before this type of thing gets imposed, and that they want the Stamp Act repealed. They don't want this or the Stamp Act and other acts of late not to be imposed. Right? So that was a communication sent to the king. Meanwhile, we have going on, in addition to the Stamp Act, we have the Sugar Act, we have the Townsend Act, and we have the debate that was taking place during that time. So in the midst of this debate, there we go, and I'm gonna pronounce the last name Barr. It might be Beret or something like that.
It does appear to be an accent aigu over the E, so it's Barret.
Is it Barret? Okay. Well, he stood up for the colonists in debate regarding the passage of the Stamp Act. And his speech is significant to America because the revolutionary group that would have been known as terrorist insurgents if we had lost the Revolutionary War, but are considered patriots because we won, took their name directly from this speech that he made. So he was explaining, and in a very passionate speech, by the way, to Parliament, that the colonists' response to this imposition would be very unpredictable. If you could predict anything, it would be that it would be bad PR for the government. That yes, you're going to piss them off. He responded to his main critic, Charles Townsend, went off about, we take care of these colonists. They should respect the rule of the UK, and he had this whole speech directed back at Townsend, pointing out that the colonies existed actually due to people fleeing oppressive conditions in Britain, facing many hardships of settling the unknown, untamed land to get away from that. So they went into potential death. They went into guaranteed hardship to get away from being told how they could worship and who they could associate with and so on. In his monologue on this, in his description about this, he described all of the variety of things that the colonists had been through. Like, the speech is actually available. I don't know if I linked to it. Yeah, I did. Good. I didn't think to put that up earlier, but in the meantime, he pointed out, the government did nothing for them during that time, or very little for them during that time. And during all of that, like, he referred to the colonists in America as the Sons of Liberty. So that is where the name Sons of Liberty came from. And let's see if this actually shows. Of course it freezes. There we go. Charles Townsend basically said, "And now will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished up by our indulgence until they are grown to a degree of strength and opulence, and protected by our arms, will they grudge to contribute their might to relieve us from the heavy weight of that burden which we lie under?" So basically, he's like, they don't want to pay us back for all that we did for them when they were fledgling colonies. And that was just a couple of sentences, and as you can see, there are 3 paragraphs. He went on a rant. It's great. And I love the speech, right? No! Planted by your care? No! Your oppressions planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny, then to a then uncultivated and inhospitable country, where they exposed themselves to almost all the hardships to which human nature is liable, and among others to the cruelties of a savage foe, the most subtle, and I take upon me to say the most formidable of any people upon the face of God's earth. And it's, he went on like that. I mean, the colonists faced starvation. They faced weather they had never seen before. They faced people they couldn't communicate with who didn't want them there. They faced animals they'd never dealt with before. That just all of these things. The same thing that happened with the prison colony in Australia, actually. There was a lot of nature in both the Americas and in Australia that came as a surprise to travelers. That nature could behave this way and produce these things that do these things to you if they get a hold of you. And that cats could get this big. But yeah, So he went through, nourished up by your indulgence. He addressed each one. They protected by your arms, and pointed out the use of colonists in war against France in the 7 Years' War. They took up arms. They bled and died, right? So if you get a chance to look up this speech, and of course when I do make the timeline publicly available, I will, this is linked so people can read it. So the Sons of Liberty, there we go. The Sons of Liberty then formed out of a group called the Loyal Nine. They were loyal to the colonies, not to the crown. But they actually became an organization that was throughout the colonies, and they organized protests. They organized all kinds of actions, and it started out again as objection to the Stamp Act, but over time it became more of an overall response to tyranny, to conflict, to everything that was going on during the time period before the Revolutionary War. So there were meetings, there were discussions, they were occupiers, I guess you could say. They were rabble-rousers. And right before the time period of the point in time where the Boston Tea Party happens, there had been multiple little skirmishes and conflicts, protests, that where there had been vandalism, where there had been goods damaged and property damaged and so on. Like they were not quietly standing on street corners and just saying things. They actually had quite a bit of activity going on. And in the meantime, one of the big protests was, of course, to the monopoly of the British East India Tea Company. And because of the imposition of not just a tax, but a monopoly, where tea was regarded, they determined that, well, we're just not going to let them deliver their tea. It's not coming in. It's going to sit in their ships, and then it's going to go right back out. We're not taking it.
If I was around at the time, I would have been right on board of this. People like to imagine, like, if you were around in Nazi-occupied Europe, would you have been on the side of the Nazis, or would you have been on the side of the resistance? And people like to play fast and loose with this, as though they even knew what was going on. But given what we're doing now, it seems evident that we would have been on the side of the resistance. And I like to think, if I was around in the late 1700s, even if I lived in Britain, I would have, because I'm a fucking Brexit voter. I'd have been, hell yeah, no taxation without representation. I don't even drink tea. Fuck tea. I'm a coffee drinker. I'd be like, I'm fucking throwing tea into the Thames while I still can. And I'd have been like, fuck it, we should join the United States. We should become the one of the states, or I guess England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland wasn't a thing at the time. We should have become 3 of the states in the American Federation, and then I guess 250 years later, I'd be going, oh shit, well that was a mistake, given what the fucking American government's doing now. But but maybe if we came together as one nation, we could have. Actually, probably not.
To be honest,
there was no way out of this bullshit. This is all.
It still would have ended badly, just because it's too big, right? My opinion, I don't approve of government at all. I don't think that it's the best way to manage human relationships, but it's the way that humans have chosen to manage human relationships for thousands and thousands of years, right? So obviously, I'm outvoted on this. But if we're gonna do it that way, which obviously we are, the next best thing is for it to be a loose conglomerate of much smaller, self-governing bits and pieces, as opposed to one all-encompassing, trying to manage the entire population government. The bigger the population the government entity is trying to manage, the more individual people end up getting squeezed and oppressed, because their interests, they're not respected, and their individuality, that's not respected. Their autonomy, not respected. When the bigger it gets, the less the government recognizes the boundaries between its authority and your autonomy. And I think smaller population levels within a governed body. So basically, like, it's better if the states make most of the decisions than it is if the federal government makes most of the decisions. And there's a whole lot of things that even the states are too big for, and maybe the county level should be how those decisions are made. And only things that are of national need and interest, like maintaining a military, should have federal involvement. Because that way, if you have something going on that's a violation of your autonomy and your rights, you don't have to go all the way to the federal level. You just go to your local government, and if you can't get respect from your local government, you take your labor and your tax dollars and you go to another area and you live where you're treated better. And that keeps the government honest, because if they want people to live in their vicinity and support their ideas and their initiatives, then they have to treat people fairly, right? And they can't keep you there, so because they're not big enough. But yeah, so what's going on at that time of the Boston Tea Party is this decision has been made. We're just not going to take your tea. Fuck your tea. Just you keep your tea. You can have your monopoly, but we're not going to accept any of your products. So it's just we'll do without. And of course the British East India Company went along and said, "Well, we're going to ship to you anyway. If you would just accept this shipload
so
of
like them."
Yep. If you would just accept this shipload of tea coming into your harbor, that'd be great." And the Boston Tea Party was the Sons of Liberty going, "No." Like that. But it took a little longer than that, right? The ships sat in the harbor, and the British representatives, the British government representatives, said, "You got to pay this tax, or we're going to take military action." And the colonists were like, we're not going to pay taxes on this. We're not accepting the shipment. Take it back. We don't want it. Right? So you had this conflict going back and forth, and they had a deadline. If you don't pay the tax by this point in time, we're going to we're going to initiate an action, a military action. And it gets up to the deadline when the tax had to be paid. And the Sons of Liberty had been meeting about this and discussing this and trying to figure out what they were going to do. And they finally decided that, well, we're going to have to actually take action ourselves and show them this is what we're going to do. So they disguised themselves, but I mean, they had to know that it was going to be known that it was colonists. They just didn't want the British military to be able to pick out which colonists did it, because then they would all be hanged. So they went in. Let's see. The deadline to pay the tax on the tea the Dartmouth delivered to Boston was December 17th. Immediately following the arrival of the Dartmouth, at the end of November 1773, pamphlets distributed by the Sons of Liberty appeared throughout the streets of Boston proclaiming, "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detested tea shipped for this port by the East India Company, is now arrived in the harbor. The hour of destruction or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face." And notice it says manly, not citizens or anything like this. This was all, women did not stick their necks out in this way. Right? There were women in the Revolution that acted as spies. There were women that did a lot of different support methods for the Revolution. And, they did stick their necks out. They could have been executed for their crimes just as well as the men. But they did not do combat. They did not do this. And contrary to feminist claims, it isn't because the men didn't let them. It's because it just wasn't normal for women to be expected to have to do that. When there was fighting to be done, everybody knew that it was male obligation, not female obligation at this point in time in this culture.
Women probably did it in a sort of guerrilla warfare sense.
Yep.
I guess they stood there holding their hands up going, "I'm just a woman, I can't do anything." And then they pull a dagger out of their skirt and go, shank, shank, shank.
We can guarantee,
which is fine. It's a good way of playing out the warfare.
You can guarantee women would use everything they had to their advantage because they wanted their freedom too. But again, what they didn't do, and just a reminder, the way the warfare was done at the time changed because of the American Revolutionary War. Right? It was it used to be that it was done out in the open, in a big open area, and two lines of troops would run across a field at each other and make themselves open targets for each other, and at the same time, open threats to each other. And what the colonists had learned from the Native Americans was that's really dumb. You don't have to do that, especially if you're surrounded by forest lands and all kinds of hills and valleys and rivers and lakes and swamps. There were areas of the colonies where you could hide in a location and then let them come after you, and then when they came after you, they might end up in a bog, and it was particularly bad place to end up. But yeah, the guerrilla warfare kind of became common in European warfare after that because of that. But so they we have Albert Nader Retro gave us $5 Canadian and says they dressed up like a bunch of Native Americans and committed an act of treason against king and country. They tried to set up natives to take the fall. Now they knew the British would know that wasn't real Native Americans. They wouldn't have any reason to do that. The Native Americans didn't care if the colonists got tea from Britain. It was the colonists that had been making protestations. So that basically that doesn't fly as an allegation. It'd be one thing if there were a bunch of communications back and forth between the tribes and the crown about the tea, like there had been between the colonists and the crown about the tea, but that's not how history played out, right? That's a bit revisionist there. But in any case, so for almost a month, they had daily meetings. Albert Hitteretto gave us $2 Canadian and said, "Oh great, now you're blaming guerrillas." No. They're one of my favorite bands.
They're
They
not
did.
even a
They didn't do
band.
nothing, huh?
They're not even a band.
I know.
It's just Damon Albarn and a cartoonist.
Yeah, but I
They're not even
still
real
love the
gorillas.
music. Well, no, we all are in a way, but so in any case, yeah, the meetings took place, the protests started, the grumblings were spread throughout the colonies, and then they began organizing the Boston Tea Party. So let's see if I can. They referred to this as the tea crisis, by the way. It like there was no there were they would have called it Teagate if it had happened after Watergate, but there were no gates. So this is everybody always kind of talks about, well, how did people refer to these things before Watergate? They called them crises. So once again, let's see, did I want to? Here we go. This is where I wanted to go next. The secret plan, which is taking its time opening. I should have had this open before the show. All right. See, yeah. This is the one I was wanting. When the Dartmouth refused to pass to safely bail out and leave, like, we won't harm you if you just go. And then they refused to go. And we knew, or they knew that there would be military action from the Brits if they did nothing. The Sons of Liberty began planning a last resort alternative if they couldn't get the conflict solved the way they wanted. And obviously that was to board the ship and throw the tea overboard. At the time, the Lieutenant Governor, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was the final word. He was the guy that made the decision in regards to colonial policy in Massachusetts. And he refused to cooperate with the people's demands, so Samuel Adams was like, this is it. We're at a stalemate. Meeting can do nothing more to save the country. And this was to thousands of people. This was not, like, when I say secret meetings and everything, it makes it sound like, a room full of people in a back room in a tavern. Like, no. They had a tree they met under frequently called the Liberty Tree, and there was this huge grassy area and this huge, like, park area around it. When this was taking place, everybody and their uncle showed up to hear about this. So this was a community-wide response, not just an angry band of rabble-rousers. The rabble was roused already.
Kind of like those meetings we have as quote-unquote MRAs, and then we get mainstream media journalists claiming they've infiltrated it.
Yeah.
This public meeting that we've advertised to the world. and these fucking
well, they do that all the time, right?
Turn up and go, look, we've infiltrated this public meeting. It's full of conspiracy theorists.
They do that all the time. I still remember when I came out under my real name after, my kids were old enough that Child Protective Services was no longer a threat that feminists could use against me, because they had been doing that. And I had been going by Della Burton up until that point. And now that my parents have passed away, I can tell you that was a combination of part of my mom's name and my dad's name. So, but in any case, I had been Della Burton for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, as a writer on A Voice for Men and as a speaker in the early episodes of HBR Talk. When I finally said, okay, it's safe. By the time they are able to take any action, my youngest will be too old for them to have jurisdiction. He'll be 18. So, coming out under my real name, Hannah Wallen. And the next week, David Futrell published my real name on his website as if it was a dox. I have discovered... totally exposing the unknown fact. Like, I was just like, you have that information because I came out, right?
What a douche.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just feminists. It's what passes for journalism with feminists.
Yeah.
The secret information that was made publicly available is now no longer a secret because I discovered that it was made publicly available, and now I'm exposing it.
Like even when they're not technically doxing you, they still proudly proclaim that they've doxed you.
Yeah.
They like to think that they've committed the arguable crime of doxing you, even when they haven't. They're just proud of having committed a crime that they haven't committed.
Well,
is it a crime to dox people yet? I don't know if it is.
It's not. It is, but it's not. Like, there's no criminal law in the United States, at least, that uses the term doxing. But according to the Violence Against Women Act, it is considered stalking. If you engage in a course of conduct within the borders of the United States that would be reasonably expected to cause your target substantial emotional distress. So doxing can be a crime if you do it in a way that would be reasonably expected to cause fear and anxiety and intimidation for one's safety. And it does actually also say those things. Like, if it's reasonably expected to cause someone to fear for their safety, you can be convicted of stalking and harassment. Now, obviously what Futrell did, there's no reasonable interpretation of that makes it upsetting. It's just sad and funny. And it's more funny than sad. Like, I have never stopped laughing at that. Every time I think about it, I get a giggle. Yes, I'm so exposed! But we had a guy come on Twitter in response to Futrell's writing about us that published the addresses, the home addresses of a bunch of MRAs. And among the things that he published about me was 5 different addresses that he was claiming were my address. And, they were all places where I had lived that at some point that were publicly available online. So he didn't expose information that was private or anything. It was information you could get for $1. But at the same time, he was highlighting it in a place where there were people who were openly hostile toward all of Voice for Men writers, and I was one of those writers. And one of those addresses, I knew the people that lived there, and they didn't do anything. Like, they were not people that were part of the men's rights movement. They didn't have any conflict with feminists. They weren't, like, the husband didn't like feminists very much, but he didn't go out and say stuff and do stuff about it. He wasn't responsible for anything I did. And it was upsetting to me that somebody might go to their house and harass them. And, one of those places was my parents' house. And then there were a couple of places where I had lived. I had rented an apartment, and the addresses of those apartments were given. And I have no idea who lives in those places now. Like I rented an apartment for a few years and then moved on. And so complete strangers could have been, if somebody decided to show up on people's doorsteps because of this poster, complete strangers would have been harassed, right, for things that they had no idea, or somebody might have showed up to bother my parents. I had to call my parents and tell them, if somebody you don't know shows up on the doorstep and starts asking about me, call the police, lock the doors, don't let them in, because this happened. And
because you might get Mark Angelucci.
well, we didn't know that level of violence was going to happen at the time, but we also didn't know that it wasn't. We did know by that time that when we tried to have a peaceful conference about fathers' rights and due process rights and things that everybody should care about, we had bomb threats. Like, people tried to stop a conference about family unity and the right to have your literal human right to not be punished without due process of law, without having proof laid out that you did what you're accused of to be punished for. That's deserving of a bomb threat. I mean, kids can be subjected to all kinds of bizarre sexual nonsense from adults today, and they don't get bomb threats, right? But if you might suggest that hitting people is just as wrong if those people are men as it is if those people are women, you deserve bomb threats. That's what we basically were told, right? That's what we were subjected to. So it was scary. But it wasn't as scary for me as it was for some of the guys. Right? One of the guys had a daughter in kindergarten. And the Voice for Men Docs account that was targeting us published on Twitter the address of the school that child went to. That is, there's no way to interpret that other than to say it was intended as a threat.
Yeah.
And he contacted law enforcement. Law enforcement contacted Twitter because when he contacted Twitter, they determined that that was not abuse.
So yeah, those of you who have wives and children, I don't blame you for pulling back and capitulating somewhat to the narrative, because you don't want your wives and children being killed. But if you could, if go ahead and not demonize those of us who are in a position to stand behind everything we say, because we don't have children who can be killed. I mean, that would be great. I mean, all of us, all of us are in it for the right reasons, one way or another. Well, not all of us, but it's understandable that people get scared when they have loved ones that can be targeted, because that's even worse than yourself being targeted.
It's actually not understandable when people don't get scared.
It's much like apparently when you join one of those secretive federal agencies, you're trained to what to do in the event of your wife and children being targeted. And I don't know how much of this is mythical, but the training is that you should be able to sacrifice your loved ones for the sake of the agency. And that isn't something we do because we're not a federal agency. We're not even a cult. This is also something cults will do. They will defoo you from your family. Again, this is not something we will do. If anyone does it, I, for one, will disavow them readily and strongly. But at the same time, some of us are out here without all that many contacts. We're out here just doing what has to be done, and it's sort of understandable that. Well, not even that that's the reason we don't have kids. The fact that we don't have kids sort of makes us less susceptible in all sorts of emotional ways. Like, I don't even know where to take it from there. But if you can at least refrain from saying, you childless people can't be trusted. No, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, we're not the ones.
You childed people have a point of contact whereby you can be manipulated. And I'm not saying I'm better than childed people. I'm just saying.
But you're not as vulnerable because there isn't, if you have children, the scariest thing in the world is something potentially happening to your children out of your control where you can't protect them and you can't. And that doesn't stop when they reach adulthood, right? You could be 80 years old, and your kids could be 60 years old, and you would still have that fear of something bad happening to them outside of your control. You could be going through health conditions that end up burdensome to your children because they care about you. And one of the things that goes through your mind is, I'm sorry they have to deal with this. Both of my parents apologized to me for being sick in their old age. And I had to explain, like, this is just part of being a family. You took care of Grandma and Grandpa. I'm taking care of you. Don't apologize. It's not your fault.
Yeah, that's what happens.
It's when you love somebody as much as you love your children, there is no rational limit. And, it does make you vulnerable. It makes you vulnerable in ways that nothing else can touch. And it gets used against people by the worst of the worst. General Flynn, the reason that he was vulnerable to being made to confess to something that he didn't do was because his son was threatened by the people that made him confess. And you imagine sitting in a room full of people with absolute power that you cannot prevent from doing horrible things as abuses of that power, telling you, it's too late for you. You're going to be treated as guilty of this regardless of whether you confess or not, but you can help your son. If you confess, we won't trump up charges against him and go after him in addition to you.
God, what a mind fuck, man. I'd do the same thing. I would do the same thing. I would absolutely roll over if it meant to save my child.
And it is one of the worst abuses, one of the worst types of torture that is used by oppressive governments.
Yeah.
And the United States government did that to a family.
So this is not a point of contention that should divide us. There are people who are childed, and there are people who are childless. There are people who choose to remain childless. There are people who, for under whatever circumstances, have to be childless. And there's, we really shouldn't be pointing the finger at each other and identity politicking against each other, saying, "Well, you're childless and you're childless." No, as long as we're at least ostensibly on the same side, we should be on the same side. It's much like Christians and atheists. Like, I know we have our differences, But we really shouldn't be arguing with each other when we have a common enemy. That it's fucking Islam. I'm gonna go ahead and say I don't fucking care if we get demonetized, let alone cancelled for it. But yeah, we're getting rapidly, invaded by that particular part of the world. And if we're sat here as atheists and Christians arguing amongst each other, then we're only volunteering for the divide part of the divide and conquering.
I won't even go that far.
If we have a common enemy, we should come together against that common enemy.
It's not even all of Islam. It's just the radical, the part that would be called evangelical, and forceful if they were Christians. And if Christians acted like that, they would end up being prosecuted for it. Because there's been a pretty good-sized Muslim population in the United States that didn't try to impose religious change on people who didn't want it, and didn't try to impose cultural change on people who didn't want it for decades. At least not in terms of religion, right? Some of them contributed to the civil rights movement very well. Some of them were actually quite great in terms of getting people to understand that if something is a human right, your human demographic doesn't change whether it applies to you. Right? That's what the civil rights movement was about. It's not the woke shit of racism and anti-racism. But there's an obvious divide in that religious community, and it's unfair to say that the part of that community that gets oppressed by the more violent part of that community is in any way responsible for the behavior of the violent part of that community. Because it would be very similar to saying that, Baptists and Methodists and, all of the various Protestant denominations are responsible for the Catholic Church suppressing allegations of abuse within its ranks. Like, we don't have any control over that. So, but I will say this. We should have had a good balance here in the U.S. in regard to how to handle that. Not the Catholic thing, but the Islam thing. We're supposed to have freedom of religion here. And the concept of freedom of religion comes from the amendment in our Constitution that says that the church is not allowed to control the state. The state is not allowed to establish a church and control the church, and it's not allowed to impose the church on the people. So if you choose to practice, or if you choose not to practice, that's supposed to be up to you. And if you choose a particular practice, that's supposed to be up to you. The only thing you're not allowed to do is violate your neighbor's boundaries by breaking laws against violence and trespassing and stuff like that as part of your religious practice. Can't do that. That's the only limit, really, that's supposed to be put to your religious freedom. And unfortunately, we have a lot of different groups right now trying to vie for political power for their religious affiliations. And the way I look at it, based on how I was raised in the Christian Union denomination and how I feel about denomination now, like I'm in opposition to the idea of dividing Christianity up into a bunch of little sects that fight with each other. It's fine if you categorize yourself and what you believe with a name, but it's dumb to say other groups aren't also equally Christian, and I'm seeing a lot of that, right? And it screws things up. But the relationship that you make with deity when you practice a religion is only real if it's consensual. And so all of the different religions that turn around and say, well, you have to go to our church, you have to practice our religion, you have to subscribe to our beliefs, you have to follow our laws, or we're going to find a way to use the government to punish you. They're actually undermining themselves, in my opinion. And to me, that's one of the differences between a practice of faith and a search for a personal code of ethics and a relationship with the divine versus actually being in a cult. And I could go on a longer rant about that, but I think it's very important to. It's not like with feminism, where feminism is based on the false allegation that all men throughout history have been part of a either deliberate or accidental conspiracy to oppress women for men's benefit, right? Islam may be a cobbled together belief system, but it's not a false allegation against everybody who's not Muslim in terms of its belief system. That's not what it's based on. It's not its underlying scaffolding. So I don't hold to treating it as a monolith. Like, they've been killing each other over differences in their beliefs for the whole time the religion has existed. And so I don't think it helps us to decide that we're going to exclude those men. And it is largely those men, because it's men who get sacrificed in conflict, in that religious conflict, and it's men who take the brunt of punishment whenever laws are violated in that religion. So and there are fathers' rights issues in Muslim cultures because of the legal rights that Muslim women do have in those cultures. And I know people think they don't have legal rights there, but there are a whole set of laws governing how wives and mothers are to be treated. So they do. And then there's also the issue of false allegations and due process. And these things apply to every group of people, regardless of their religion. And I don't want to exclude people. It's fair to criticize the act of imposition of a belief system on a population that doesn't want it, but it's not fair to generalize. So that's just my take on it.
Well, there's no need to exclude people based on their demographic, and I say demographic as opposed to group, because the difference is demographic is that which can be established by something physical or something geographical. This is something I've been pushing on recently. The only identities we need are your name, your identity as an individual, your sex, whether you're a man or a woman, or your nationality, and that, to me, is as far as it goes, as far as necessary cohesion pertains to. And that doesn't mean excluding anyone based on their identity beyond that. It means not including people just because of their identity. This is something we're seeing in the UK a lot quite recently, and indeed Europe quite recently. People are saying, we are Muslim, we deserve this because we are Muslim and we have had this. And I'm like, okay, right, I hear you, but that doesn't matter to me. You just saying that you have this identity based on the book on which you believe. This is something Christians don't do quite so much. Some of them do, but not quite so much any recently. Christians have diluted their identities down to the necessary things, like what country you live in, what sex you are, and what your name is, because that's all you really need. And I'm not saying we should exclude people because of their religion. I'm just saying when they demand that they be included because of their religious identity, we can just go, no, that's not how anything works. That's
It's
not an
not a
identity.
reason.
It's not an identity that we should have any obligation to accept. This is a country. The only identity you need to be in this country is the identity of that country. There is nothing beyond that. And yeah, this is very tricky to get through. But
yeah, you're experiencing a problem that's been ongoing in the United States for my whole lifetime, and was occurring probably for just about that long prior. The concept of us being a nation of immigrants, it's a half-truth, right? Originally, yes, we were a nation of immigrants, but there is a huge contingent of the population here that can trace their lineage as residents, as citizens of the United States, back to the Mayflower, right? Back to the various first immigrants from Europe, and we're talking hundreds of years. We're talking generations. And yes, they will also have ancestors who were later immigrants. And yes, there are people who are first-generation Americans in every generation. And yes, that is a good thing. And it's important to us. But no, it doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries and you can't tell people you have to meet these standards, you have to do these things to become a citizen here, so that we know that you are going to be a loyal citizen of this country and you're not here as a spy from another country or as part of a crime syndicate. I mean, that's fair. But that debate has been taking place, and you get accused of hating people based on race for making the argument that we want our citizens to be upstanding, law-abiding citizens who are citizens because they care about the American way of doing things. They want to live here, to be part of the culture here, and not to undermine it. Like that makes you racist now in the United States, and it has for years. So it's an issue that's, we're used to seeing it, and it's interesting to see it happening elsewhere. I think Canada probably has some similarity to us in that. Probably has similar experience with that over the last century, but now it's happening all over Europe, and Europeans haven't had that debate for a century. They're having that debate now, and it's a new debate, and it's your growing pains. Like, we feel it, and the thing that has to be settled is you have to be able to have the debate without being silenced, and unfortunately, we have constitutional law that protects us against being told you can't talk about that because it offends people. And in an environment where you don't have that, and you get arrested because somebody was offended by one of your tweets, that's going to hinder your ability to have that discussion.
Just a bit.
Yeah. But in the meantime, we're going to go back to 1773. And when there was no United States government yet. The closest we had was that meeting of the Continental Congress, which was, again, that was not like Congress. That was a meeting of colonists who were trying to hash out a way to ask the British government to have a nicer relationship with the colonies. And the British government kind of ignored it because they didn't think they had to do anything. They didn't think it was necessary to address it. Albert Nader Retro gave us $2 Canadian and suggested you need to have Aidan Paladin on to discuss Islam. I think we have done that and actually I think we have done that more than once. But I also think like lately she's been kind of busy.
She got bigger than us and she moved on. It's
Well,
so many badgers have come through our channel and then got bigger than us. And
yeah, the last time I
moved
talked
on.
to her, she was swamped with things that she had to do. Oh, and actually, we have a comment. In the super chats. Well, we have Meredith G's HBR Talk 308 Honey for the Badgers comment. Thank you, Meredith G. She gave us $5. But there's a note from Allison in there to read the last comment from the last show. Maintaining Frame is a cool show. Gave us $5 and said, "Hi, y'all. I really like the Maintaining Frame series. Thanks." And I think that's the one she was talking about. Because the other ones look like they may have been read during the show. If they didn't read the one about the 65-foot hot dog sculpture in Times Square, that would be a shame. Just saying. But you'll all have to go back to find the Maintaining Frame show and find out. But yeah, so we left Adams speaking to thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House, and you know, I pointed out that the rabble was roused already, but yeah, so that was enough. The Sons of Liberty decided they were going to take action. There was a lot of cheering. There was much rejoicing. They already had the plan laid out. They knew what they were going to do. They got ready. They dressed up in their best interpretations, by the way. That doesn't necessarily mean it was accurate. It just had to disguise them and didn't have to actually fool anybody. In terms of, you know, who they, what race they were and all that. And they got mustered at the Fort Hall and marched to the wharf. You know, where this is an interesting, an eyewitness account. John Andrews, a merchant. They mustered, I'm told, upon Fort Hill to the number of about 200. You know, the way people talk about the Boston Tea Party, a lot of times you think of this band of like maybe 20 guys showing up and throwing a tea overboard. 200, about 200 people, proceeded 2 by 2 to Griffin's Wharf, where Hall, Bruce, and Coffin lay. Those were the ships, each with 114 chests of the ill-fated article on board, the tea. And before 9 o'clock in the evening, every chest from on board the 3 vessels was knocked to pieces. They broke it open and flung over the sides. They say the actors were Indians from, I don't know, Narragansett. I don't remember Narragansett. Whether they were or not, to a transient observer, they appeared as such, being clothed in blankets with the heads muffled and copper-colored countenances, being each armed. They put on red face. Oh, God. That's funny. Each armed with a hatchet or an axe and a pair of pistols, nor was their dialect different from what I conceive these geniuses to speak, as their jargon was unintelligible to all but themselves. So, like, the symbolism of the Indian dress. The disguise was more symbolic than anything. They knew they would be recognized as non-Indians. They knew everybody was going to know, right? They knew that the British government had no reason to believe that suddenly the Mohawk would be just outraged that there were ships arriving in the harbor to deliver tea to the white people. Like, they were not going to care. The act of wearing Indian dress was to express through symbolism to the world that American colonists identify themselves as Americans, no longer considered themselves British subjects. Right?
Yeah.
So that was their way of saying, yes, we are committing treason, fuck you.
Love it.
And that essentially set off the conflict. And of course, the rest of the timeline. Stop telling me to save my work. I'm not saving my work. I mean, it's already saved. You had oops, we already read about the massacre and everything. We get the start of battles. We have, after the Tea Party, we have the Intolerable Acts, 5 new laws in rapid succession. So the list is the Boston Port Bill closed off the Port of Boston, eliminating commerce and trade to the city. So they basically said, all right, you didn't like our tea? You can't have anything. The Administration of Justice Act granted a change of location to Great Britain or a British colony in the event of a jury trial. In other words, all right, you want a jury trial? You have to get on a ship. And you have to sail off to the nearest British colony would have been in Canada at that point. Because we had rebels here saying that they were a separate country now, so it's not counting them. Massachusetts Government Act limited colonial power and reinstated royal governance, so they sent a governor. The Quartering Act allowed the new Governor General, Thomas Gage, to house British soldiers in private homes and inns and other buildings without permission from the colonists. And they could just, come in and stay in your house and eat your food and take your stuff and break your stuff and so on. They didn't even have to be polite about it. And then there was the Quebec Act. This was in 1774. Designated the western region north of the Ohio River as part of Quebec and made Roman Catholicism the established religion of Quebec, upsetting the colonial Protestants. And by the way, that includes where I live right now. It includes where I was born and raised. So, had America lost the Revolutionary War, I would be Canadian.
What a hideous thought.
Yeah, Canada probably feels the same way since I tell rape jokes. We know at least one guy in Canada doesn't like that.
Well, maybe Canada could have done with some Ohio in its constituency.
Yeah.
It might have based it up somewhat, or maybe not if it was only to become part of Quebec. I mean, even most Canadians will be like, "Yeah, fuck Quebec."
Yep. So there we go. And again, this is all stuff that when I make this public, you'll be able to find links to articles. Dang it. Sorry. There is no reason for me to even need to cough right now. But you'll be able to find links to source material for the statements. Albert Nader Retro gave us $2 Canadian and said, "Hey, McClinic, nice." Oops, of course it has to jump on me, so I can't see it now. "Nice party, no whiskey, we dump tea now." And then we had another one from Albert Nader Retro, gave us $2 Canadian and said, "Okay, nobody should have Quebec forced on them." Oh, jeez.
How is Quebec still a thing? You've chased France out of every other part of North America. Why is it still there in Quebec?
Yeah, that's where all the
just
French
let them
Canadians
secede. Let them secede. Like after a year of their secession, they'll be like, "Oh, je suis désolé. This was all a mistake. We will come back to you now."
Yeah. Well, they might.
It's the same with California and Scotland. Just let them do it for a year and see what the fuck happens.
Yeah. Well, there's one place in the U.S. that has had some rumblings about secession that actually, I think, if they did secede, they could succeed, if that makes sense. And it might actually be a blow to the U.S. economy. And that is Texas.
Yeah.
As I don't think that there's a state in the union that doesn't have people that have a lot of respect for Texas, and it's just because, memes aside, well, no, not memes aside. Screw that. Texas is the Chuck Norris of states.
Yes, it is.
If it wasn't for the fact that it gets hotter than the surface of the sun there in the summertime, I might have convinced my family to move there. But yeah, I don't deal well with that level of heat, and there's a lot of humidity in parts of Texas because of the ocean. So you have major heat, and then major humidity, and then Hannah stops breathing. So that doesn't work out too well. But I do have a great deal of respect for Texas, and I do think, just from looking at how the state has been my entire lifetime, I think, with its economy, with its capabilities, with the people that live there, and how stalwart they are, how tough and how capable they are, Texas could be its own country. It would be a blow to the rest of the country, though, and I hope it doesn't happen. But it is something that could successfully.
But the same could not be said for California. This is why I specified California. This is why I didn't say Alberta. If Alberta seceded from Canada, it could do quite well. Quebec, not so much. California, not so much. Like, if England seceded from the Union, it would leave everyone else hanging by a thread. And then they'd go, oh, we're very sorry. That's what California maybe being the exception, because California is huge and has a huge population and has all sorts of natural resources. But still, the fact that it's being run by communists, give them a year of not having the kickbacks from the Federation. Just see what happens if it has no one to fall back on except the communists running the place. Maybe they'd quickly realize, oh yeah, all this goddamn communism was a mistake, and I'm not recommending anything, because God knows what our enemies want is for us to break up, so that they can jump on in and take advantage of this breakup. But I don't know what it's going to take for these fucking uppity communists with ideas way above their station to actually confront the reality, the wall between reality and their communist ideology. I don't know what it's going to take for them to actually snap out of it. But maybe, maybe a year of breakup, like so many couples have. Let's see what happens if we have an open relationship for a year.
Yeah.
And then they'll come crawling back to you going, this was a mistake, I'm so sorry. And then, that's where the analogy breaks down. Because if that happens in a relationship, the right thing to do is go, yeah, sorry, fuck you. I've moved on to someone who's not a massive cunt. But it's not the case with states and countries. If these communist states can actually learn their lesson, and maybe not, I don't even know. Do you just have to leave them to become a failed state before they actually before they can finally say, yes, we were wrong? Because this is the problem with communists. They no matter what happens, they can never quite say we were wrong. It has to actually break down to a complete and utter failed state where nobody lives in houses anymore. The whole thing is just tents on streets.
Yep.
And at that point, you don't even have to negotiate how to come back together. You can just wander on in and go, oh shit, you're all homeless now. I guess we'll just pick this shit up, and possibly hang Gavin Newsom by the neck, as we always should have done. But no one wants it to get to that point. But this is why people keep talking about civil war, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a civil war. It just needs to be these certain uppity states learning how wrong they are. We can dangle them by that thread and go, okay, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens if you go by yourself. And the very moment you realize that this isn't going to work, we'll come in and save you. And by God, you had better fucking do what we say after that.
I don't know what is it going to take before people admit that we are in the midst of a civil war in the United States right now. We have had whole communities on fire. Literally on fire, not figuratively, like flames going up the sides of buildings that are multiple stories, people losing their homes and businesses, cops being trapped inside burning buildings with intent to kill them. We have had shots fired. We have veterans of battles in urban areas. What's not to call a war? Is it because the government isn't involved? Like directly? They're just standing on the sidelines handing rocks to the big kid, to the little kid throwing rocks at the big kid. And so that it's not a war, because that's how the United States does war right now. They stand on the sidelines and hand rocks to the little kid to throw at the big kid until the public starts going, look at that big kid beating up on that little kid. You got to step in and do something. And then they do. Right? So that's where we are right now.
We called it a Cold War when it happened between Russia and between the Second World and the First World.
Yeah,
I'm not sure why we would call it anything else when it happens between communist states and capitalist states.
Yeah, we have civilians that are actually engaging in violent military conflict in the streets. It's not frequent anymore, but it was. We've had a lot of, you can't even, we don't have battle names. We don't have the historical context that we usually apply. But I don't know why we wouldn't call this a war. And yeah, we called it a Cold War when the United States and Russia were posturing at each other across the ocean. But you know what was going on at the same time during that Cold War? Little proxy wars here and there in nations where the American public wouldn't be paying attention to what was going on. One of those nations was Afghanistan. Out of that proxy war, out of that proxy war came Al-Qaeda. That was the fault of the United States and Russia fighting in Afghanistan. So you look at all the shit that's happened, and that, by the way, came out of World War II, which came out of World War I, which ended the way it ended, with the imbalance that it ended with, and the level of punishment imposed on Germany that it ended with, that ended up contributing to World War II because of the United States involvement. It was already winding down when we got involved. There was actually a reason why we needed to be involved. So it goes all the way back to World War I. This notion that our warmongering doesn't have these types of effects. The terrorism that we had to deal with, the fighting that we had to deal with, the conflicts that we're not even sure were necessary in the 90s and the early 2000s, our presence in Afghanistan and the fallout of how Biden executed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that all traces back to actually Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. government at that time. And when I look at it, I look at our war history, I see it as very much like the art industry. In other words, it's a giant money laundering scheme.
Mm.
So, but those are not the wars that developed our voting history. So at the time that all of this is taking place, right, the vote system in the United States, we had two vote systems. One of them was, if you're voting for politicians, that would be your mayor, your village council, city council, whatever, your governor, any position that actually was elected. That was run the same way it was run in the UK. But when it came time to vote for what are we going to do about the way that the British government is treating the colonies, that was done with guns. And that was mostly men. Men voted to become an independent nation, and to not have access to the benefit of a long-established government that could provide military aid and so on, but also to not be oppressed by that government. And like I said, if you look at American history, not all of the women were Betsy Ross sitting in a rocking chair sewing a flag, and she did a lot of other things. But there were more women who acted in support roles where they were not at risk than there were women who acted as spies and who actually engaged in military conflict. More women who were nurses, more women who were prepared to host and feed the militias. And when the Revolutionary War came into effect, when it, the first battles that took place at Lexington and Concord happened, then there was a draft. So, and of course, there wasn't really a way to guarantee that draftees would be punished for not reporting for duty. So it was more voluntary than anything. But there was a draft. And in the meantime, at the beginning of this revolution, which, I have a little blurb about the conflict as well, during this period of time, and you can see that the time period for this actually goes from 1775 on forward here. It's expanding instead of, dang it, it's not supposed to do that. Let me drag it, and I'm going to shrink it down a little bit. Shrink. There we go. On through. There we go. So you're seeing here it's almost it's quite a stretch here. The end is actually considered to be 1783. So it's almost but not quite. It's like 8 years. But in any case, some point during that time period, one of my ancestors, my actual Irish ancestor, that I trace back to Ireland, was clunked on the head or taken while he was drunk at the age of 14 from his home, and while he was unconscious, woke up at sea on a ship headed to the colonies to fight against those crazy upstart American colonists. When he got here, he decided, fuck that, jumped ship, fled inland, and settled somewhere in Ohio. And sort of dodged the entire war. So,
wow.
And then later on, one of his descendants fought in the Civil War. And then was done out of his pension by stupid circumstances and prejudice against people who didn't have enough education to be very literate. But there you go. So the American Revolutionary War was the first, I guess you could say, the first American vote. We voted to divorce Britain. Skirmishes between the troops and the colonial militiamen had kicked off a full-on armed conflict. Britain responded by sending troops. The rebels, were determined. We're going to be independent. We're not going to be part of Britain anymore. Not going to be part of the British Empire anymore. France stepped in. France was already. You got to remember, France lost the 7 Years' War, so France was butthurt about losing Canada, and kind of went, oh, well, we can get back at Britain for this. At the same time, the French Enlightenment was, and I don't see that actually stayed on the timeline here. It might be, yeah, it's one of the things that didn't save. Oh no, there it is. Okay, so the French Enlightenment is sort of, it's thought to have, the time period of it ended in the middle of the American Revolutionary War. But a lot of the concepts that were being put into play by the American revolutionaries trace back to that. The concepts of self-governance, concepts of libertarianism and freedom, and being responsible for one's own welfare as opposed to having the government micromanage the population. All trace back to the French Enlightenment. So you had a combination of that, not happy with the way the 7 Years' War turned out, plus sympathy to the cause. And revolutionaries had been back and forth to France to discuss this with the French government at the time. So you had, like, Ben Franklin arrived in Paris in December 1776 as the first official representative of the United States in France. And they actually negotiated for France's entry into the war on the side of the United States. And of course, I don't know if the French government would have done that if they knew it was going to happen later. But at that time, there was a great deal of sympathy for the cause of the United States. What happened later, though, the American Revolution actually was quite influential in emboldening the French revolutionaries to take action against their monarchy. And that led to a whole lot of bloodshed. But what they were seeing was everything that had been under discussion, right? All of the ideas of the Enlightenment were being put into play in the United States, in this new nation, and they worked. You could have a country that way, and it wasn't a disaster. Right? It was a fledgling country, but it was a country, and so they felt that they could do the same. They could change their world. So that's something that again, men voted with their swords and their blood. I have to call it as far as an ending. I wanted to get into post-war changes that took place, because I see if I can make this more visible here. There's several areas where there's quite a bit of things happening within a few years of each other, and you'll notice I have quite a lot of stuff here. different things that changed. And as this is all going on, like, you still have the stuff that I've highlighted before. The French, British, and Dutch East India Companies. The disenfranchisement of Irish Catholics was still taking place till about halfway through the American Revolution. And then as we get forward into things that we'll look into more next week, you'll notice, I've got things marked US, Britain, Australia, Canada, because all these things were happening at once. It's like this is all within a few years' time. I have, if I move this a little bit and shrink it a little bit, I have almost a half century on this page right now. Let's shrink it down just one more. So you can see there's 1800 to 1850, and there's a whole bunch of changes. Some of them show up kind of tiny because of that, and that's above. You still have the India Company, the French East India Company existing at this point in time, and so did the British. There just was no rivalry with the Dutch at that point because the Dutch East India Company had ended. But we also have, here's the American Revolution and the French Revolution shortly thereafter, the first British penal country in Australia, and then all of this happening in France, and then right around the end of the French Revolution, we have the dissolution of the Dutch East India Company. So there's quite a bit that I can get into here, and you can sort of see, because of the proximity of these things to each other, there is some influence back and forth taking place. And, of course, the British government would have been watching as all of these things happened as well in France and in the United States, and would have been influenced. But we'll get into more of that next week. But yeah, so voting in early America, like the very beginning during the Revolution, looked like blood. That's the answer to what did voting look like in early America. But it was almost entirely men's blood. And with that, let's see if I do have a Rumble rant. Tyler Preston 555 gave us $2 and said shekels for the Badgers. Do I have any more super chats? Okay, that was the last one there. That's not, I already read that one. And I already read all the super chows. So, thanks to my two co-hosts for listening to, again, maybe the reason I'm coughing is because of how dry history can be. I don't know if this is such dry history, though. I mean, blood's pretty wet stuff. Sticky, too.
It's no coincidence that these circles are all blood-coloured. Well, I guess it is technically a coincidence. But it's funny anyway.
Yeah.
Blood is funny.
I picked that color because of the badger, right? But it is. This is a history that is written in blood. The history of suffrage is written in the blood of men.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no escaping that. There is no denying it. And there is no separating it from the obligation to be mindful of the impact of one's vote on men. And actually on women too, because men care about women. And that's an impact on men as well.
Yep.
Yeah, Mangaka has an interesting way of putting it. Men voted with their blood. Women voted with other people's blood.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't far off. That's pretty true. Women, not only do women vote with other people's blood, but they vote to spend other people's blood every time they vote to go to war.
Yeah.
Because at no point in American history have women ever been subject to selective service. The United States came close to doing that during, I want to say, World War II. But they didn't have to, because they were only considering it to draft women to be nurses in military hospitals. And enough women volunteered that they didn't have to. Because they weren't having to replace them every the amount that they were having to replace the men that got drafted. There weren't hundreds of women working in military hospitals dying like the men on the front lines.
The inflation of fiat currency is downstream from the inflation of blood and what that's worth. And by that, I don't mean blood clots, although that's ironically connected at this point in time. I mean the inflation of, this is where the terminology becomes difficult, because the inflation of the cost of blood means the deflation of the cost of men's lives.
Yep.
Work it out for yourselves, folks.
Well, and, being connected is what makes it a clot.
Yep.
So there you go. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks to my two co-hosts for the long and, I guess this could be considered a fairly spicy sausage. I guess we are having blood sausage for supper tonight.
It's not as bad as it sounds, folks.
Yeah.
It's just like acrid burned meat. Try yourself a blood sausage today.
Well, the next time we have a meeting in the UK, I will try it. I'm all up for it. I can't possibly be allergic to it because it's meat. So there you go. But thanks to everybody who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. Good night, and we will see you next Thursday.
Yeah.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.